Hey friends, welcome here. Today I'm going to be talking about why I am not a huge fan of using the word homeschooling in conversation. This is not an opinion piece about public school versus homeschooling. What my goal here is to reflect and challenge how we may be thinking about our children's education and formation, and ultimately really unpack this for myself as I traverse these waters with my own children. So I'm just going to go right into it. First of all, when a person in conversation is asking the question, which is a very common question to ask when people are starting to think about their children's education, they'll ask the question, are you homeschooling your kid? And if a person just wants to know the physical location in which you're choosing to form your child or send your child to be educated, I mean, like that in of itself is not that's not the issue I have with homeschooling. And I mean, like in that regard, that's a fine term to use, I suppose. It's a familiar term and it makes sense to use it. What I'm going to kind of unpack more here is more about going beyond that question of the physical location. Is it useful? Is it helpful? Does it make sense to use the term homeschooling? So, anyways, one of my first things that have always just like unsettled me about the term homeschooling and homeschooler, or like the terms associated with it, homeschooler, homeschooling mom, homeschooling, all these different kind of variations of the word, has always kind of unsettled me. And one of the first things is that I always find it weird when mothers identify themselves as a homeschooling mom. And I get it. Don't get me wrong. Like, it's not like I'm confused about why people use that term, and it makes sense. But I mean, I think you should reconsider using the term, because every mom is a homeschooling mom, whether or not you choose to send your child to a public school or a co-op or a boarding school or whatever, or your kids are doing most of their education or formation at home. Because the wife is like the queen of the home, and in a sense, and she schools, quote unquote, schools and forms her children from within those walls, whether that's 5 hours a day, 2 hours a day, whatever that may be. Like, every mom is a homeschooling mom in a sense. And therefore, I think that's what makes the term like redundant, because you're just a mom. Because like, why do you have to classify yourself as being a homeschooling mom when, in a sense, that is the automatic role that every wife and mother is given? So, because the reality is that regardless of whether you do most of your child's formation at home or they go to a school 5 days a week, you are still in charge of their formation. If you choose to send your kid to a school, you just put your stamp of approval of sending them to a brick and mortar school as part of their formation. But that's my point. It's like, if you're a mother who doesn't do that, you're allowed, like if you're a mom who doesn't send their kids to a school, well, it's like you're allowed to call yourself a homeschooling mom, because your kids, I guess, spend more time at home than they do other places. Whereas the mother who doesn't, well, she's just, I guess, a quote unquote normal plain mom. I think the problematic implication to the term homeschooling mom is that for the woman who doesn't choose to send her kid to a school 5 days a week, she's just a quote unquote normal plain mom. And then the homeschooling mom is like a special breed of mom, almost, that, she's doing something kind of like exceptionally different. And of course, it's, like we all are. I'm not saying, it's not hard and difficult to, have your kids be at home. There's also difficulties with sending your kid to a school. But the point is that both of those moms are moms who are supposed to be intentionally forming their children, and giving yourself the title homeschooling mom and and thinking that only homeschooling moms, in a sense, intentionally are forming their children are not helpful, is not a helpful term. It's not a helpful way to look at your role as a mother. Like, I just feel like you should ex-nay the homeschooling part, homeschooling part, because ultimately at the end of the day, you're just a mom, you're a parent, and you're just doing your job. And part of your job is forming them, and you get to choose whether you want to form them at home or you want to send them somewhere else to be formed. But the point is that you're being intentional about their formation. And just because you send them to school, it doesn't mean you've relinquished that control. At least you shouldn't believe that. And just because you quote unquote homeschool your kids at home as a homeschooling mom doesn't mean that only then you have permission to be intentional with your mothering and your forming of your kids. Because here's what I kind of think. It's as if when you label yourself as a homeschooling mom, all of a sudden you have permission to be really intentional with your kids and their schedule and their day. But there is some truth to that, because when you don't go the route of kids going to school 5 days a week, you naturally do have more of a customized schedule. But really, that's just called being a parent. And you should always be intentional with how you're forming your children, whether or not they're at home. But I think it's silly, like the way that social media, like people's handles, like the homeschooling mom or like homeschooling mom quotes, like on Pinterest, or like kind of like the term homeschooling mom has become this brand. And I think that's gotten in our heads to think that, like, as if a homeschooling mom is different than just being a mom, that being a homeschooling mom means you're some other caliber woman, and all of a sudden a homeschooling mom has apparently different demands, different expectations, different standards. And sure, like, I think there's something to say about like a certain level of intentionality, and the demands and expectations are different, sure, like on the practical level, but on the inherent level of your role and your responsibility as a mother, those don't change. The second reason why I don't like the term homeschooling is it's kind of like a practical reason, like in conversation, when we're talking, like the topic of the conversation is homeschooling, right? Like that's kind of the title of the essay. And in conversation, when people are referring to the notion of homeschooling, on the onset of the conversation, they may ask the question, like, what are you doing for homeschooling? Meaning, what curriculum, or what's your day, or what's your schedule like about in that regard? And that makes sense. Like, you know, and that's usually where the conversation starts. And that makes sense to be under the term, in a sense, homeschooling, when you're talking strictly about the academic life of your child and the education that you're providing for them or wanting to provide for them. But very often, more often than not, and I think it's subconscious, because I think we all know that the education, the academic life of our children is not the be and end all of the formation of our child. It very often goes on to things that have nothing to do with academics, or people say things about like what they want to prioritize in homeschooling that has nothing to do with academics. So maybe like they'll talk about the socializing, or they want to make sure that kids get a lot of social in. They might talk about how they want their kids to be independent in this or that thing, or how they want their kid to develop certain characters, traits, and virtues, which is good. And those are great things. But I think if that's what you want to talk about, ultimately, and you want to have a good conversation about those things, then I think a more fruitful conversation, and I guess this is like more just a practical thing of just how you steer conversation in general and asking the question that you truly want to ask, or know what you're actually asking, is like that's important to know in life in general. And when you have conversation, is like actually asking the question you're wondering, I feel like that's actually a real thing where it's like sometimes we talk about things and we ask questions that that's not actually our question, if that makes sense. But we're just like, don't know how else to say it. So we should figure out how to articulate it. But all of those things, and a lot of these things that we're talking about under the heading of homeschooling, don't have anything to do with our children's academic life. But we're putting it under the heading of homeschool. And again, we run into the same problem because that's not, to me, like talking about how you want your kid to cultivate certain virtues and characters, or like how you want them to be disciplined or have a certain like work ethic, or how you still want them to, if they're going to be doing a lot of their academics at home, or you're not planning on sending them to school, that you still want them to have a social life and like in this regard and be able to be personable. Like that's just called parenting. Like that's just called how you want to form your kid. And I think we would have way more fruitful conversations if we ask the question, hey, what are you doing and what's your plan? What's your game plan to form and educate your children? And so I would love conversations to be more about just how we're forming our children, and ask what people's thoughts are on that. It's like, and because people have given thought to it, they just haven't put it in the category of how they're intentionally parenting. They've put it in their minds under the category of how I'm quote unquote homeschooling my kid. And I get it. Like, it might be a tough question to ask. It's kind of maybe an awkward question to ask, or kind of like a shocking or like putting somebody on the spot kind of question to ask. But you know what? I think that's good. Like, I think if you ask somebody that question and they feel challenged and convicted, and because they have like no thoughts or no game plan, and it's like they've only maybe thought about the quote unquote academic life of their kid, and they don't have thoughts about how they plan to develop the whole person of their child, then I think that's good if somebody feels like kind of put on the spot. Because if you desire to be a good parent, you definitely should have thoughts on this. And so when we move the question away from being about homeschooling, or at least that term, and we ask more specific questions like, what are your plans or desires for your children's formation? How do you plan to build good character within them, their spiritual lives, good habits? How do you plan on cultivating independence? What academic subjects do you want your children to know very well, what you want them to focus on, and what academic subjects do you think would be really beneficial for their overall formation? Like, when we ask more broader and, in a sense, more important questions than that of, are you homeschooling your kid, which, like, in my opinion, doesn't matter. Like, that to me isn't much of a conversation to ask a question. What location do you plan on educating your children as part of their formation? But anyways, when we move away from that, then we make it into a conversation that is accessible to all parents, that is applicable to all parents, and that all parents should be thinking and considering, because that is their role. Regardless if you're a parent who has sent their kid to a school or not, or some sort of other hybrid, that it hasn't changed that your responsibility is to form your kid, and you have just decided that this or that thing that you have chosen to introduce into their life or put them in is what you've considered acceptable as part of their formation. Because it's just a limiting belief to the couple that has opted for the 5-day-a-week option, or the new mom, for example, who's like considering which direction to go, and she just feels so intimidated by the notion of being a quote-unquote homeschooling mom because they don't feel like they're qualified to teach their child because they are a schooling parent, right? So the schooling part is what is emphasized. The schooling part is what's being, is what makes it intimidating. And so it makes people feel uncertain about whether or not like they're capable of educating their child. And so it's like, well, I don't know if I'm, qualified to quote unquote educate my child. So maybe I should send my kid to a school where they're quote unquote educated over there. But we all know, whether like subconsciously or just by the testimony of others, that it's not just academics that your child's picking up in those environments. It's their whole their formation is what's happening. Their virtues are being cultivated there. Their habits are being cultivated there. Their dispositions and attitudes towards other people. Those are all things that are being part of their formation. That is part of their formation. But anyways, because they don't feel qualified to teach their child, to school their child, they will very often go the route of sending their kid to school, even though they are very capable of educating their child. But because the whole notion of schooling them and the term that's being used has all these implications, and I think is really intimidating for a mother. But you know what a parent is always qualified to do? Be a parent. And what is a parent's job? To form their kids so they become the kind of person that goes to heaven. And so I don't think we should let the term homeschooling mom or homeschool make you believe that you're not qualified to form your child. So I think that's definitely like one of the big reasons why I don't like using the term, because it seems like such a narrow term, and it does not do what your role is justice. And so I'm just going to wrap up here with some just quick points. Another reason why I don't like the term homeschooling mom in particular, because it's not about you. Like the term, I'm like identifying yourself as a homeschooling mom or making it into some kind of brand makes it about you when your child's formation isn't about you. It's about them. And so very often, like people kind of wear the term like homeschooling mom or homeschooling mom veteran as some sort of badge of honor, which it is because it did involve a lot of her, I'm sure. But the goal of forming your kid is not keeping them within your home. Like keeping your child within your home for their entire education is not the measure of success. But sometimes that's often what it seems like. That if you, quote unquote, homeschooled all your kids through and you kept them at home and you facilitated the curriculum, like you did a good job and you did what you were supposed to do. And I can understand why that is a big accomplishment, like, shouldering a lot of that responsibility on yourself and facilitating that. But the goal is that your child is formed in the best way possible that your child needs, which might actually not be at home. And that's, I think, another big issue. Obviously, this is a brain dump of all my issues about the term of homeschooling. So here's my other issues. Like the two primary kind of assumptions that are made in the notion of homeschooling is that as the mother, she facilitates and like does all the curriculum, does all the sit down, does all the, things one-on-one with her kids. She's the primary teacher and the kids are at home, which doesn't necessarily, and a lot of the times doesn't happen all the time, like strictly like that. Very often, when people don't send their kids to a school 5 days a week, they do some sort of co-op or some sort of hybrid or something like that. But either way, that's not necessarily the goal. The goal isn't to checkmark that you kept your child at home for the last 18 years of their life and didn't send them anywhere else to be educated or have their formation be done, and that you were the only person to kind of speak into their life or facilitate anything for them, like that's not necessarily the goal. The goal is that they have a good formation, and that might mean sending them somewhere that isn't home sometimes, especially when they get older. It's about doing whatever is best for their personal formation. It might mean getting a private tutor for certain subjects or certain things that they would benefit more from, because learning from a skilled expert might be better than you who has a very rudimentary knowledge of that thing, you know? But my point is, like, we make it so much about ourselves when we like identify and label ourselves as a homeschooling family or a homeschooling mom. That's not the point. The point is that that the kids receive the kind of formation that sets them up for success and for sanctity. And so in some regard, I don't think that it really matters who is doing the like teaching or the formation in some ways, or where it's located, because it doesn't have to be at home. But what matters is that you, as the parent, are intentionally crafting the kind of formation that will best serve your specific child. And that's what matters in this whole conversation, is not whether you're a homeschooling parent or a quote-unquote homeschooling parent, or you send your kid to a school. It's about what gives the best formation to your kid. And obviously then that's a different, stream of conversation of what will give the best formation to your kid. Sure, but I'm not talking about that here. I'm just talking about maybe how we need to rethink, maybe the implications we have with homeschooling, and maybe even petition to, like, for me, I don't like using it. Like, I kind of want to dispel using the term in conversation. I will caveat that in the younger years, I do believe you, as the quote-unquote educator and former, and at home as the location, is best, I think, best for your child, especially when they're very young and susceptible. But I'm saying as they get older, as they have more interest, as they need outside influences and things like that, as they become their own independent person, that might not necessarily always be the case. And so we should make it less about us and more about what they need. And finally, I hope these thoughts are like freeing, and take some sort of pressure off. For me, I personally felt like it was, like, when I came to these kind of realizations for myself, that like the goal here is a good formation. Because I definitely wouldn't say that I necessarily am the most confident when it comes to equipping them with the best quote unquote education, academic life, but I feel very confident, hopeful, and excited about the notion of providing them with a good overall formation, and how my husband and I plan to facilitate that. Because at the end of the day, though their academics and the education in which they receive is important, I think we all realize on a day-to-day level and know that the academic portion of your child's formation is not the be and end all of their formation, and that very often the success and what a child reaps from their academic life, a lot of that is based on what their character is like, what their disposition and attitudes are towards hard work and things like that. And we definitely can craft and create a lot of that. I think here would be a good place to wrap up. I hope this podcast just gave some good thoughts, maybe challenged you to rethink the beliefs maybe you have attached to the term homeschooling, whether consciously or subconsciously, and that it has contributed to just an overall deeper reflection on how you desire and what you desire to gift your child in terms of their formation that will best suit them. Thanks for joining me this week, friends. Till next time, God bless.